Checkpoints is presented by pharmaceutical company GM Pharma.
How does the crisis within the NBG affect investment climate in Georgia, and what are some of the risks associated with Natia Turnava's unilateral decision? How does the crisis affect one most important thing in doing business, trust? Fady Asly, chairman of ICC Georgia, sat down with the checkpoints. Mr. Asly, thank you for being with us and taking our questions. The International Monetary Fund has concerns over the decision made by Georgia National Bank to change its approach on international financial sanctions. This is what the mission head, James John, told us in a written statement. What does this mean for Georgia, its citizens? And I don't mean only investors, businesses at this point, like all of us.
Let's start with the change of legislation, which is something that surprised the whole world, not only the Georgians or the embassies accredited here and international financial institutions. This is a direct message to the international community that we don't want to comply by the sanctions. You can do many things as a government, but you cannot escape international law and international procedures. Even Russia did not come with such a very creative approach to shortcut sanctions. This is a novelty. There is no country in the world that has done it. And it's a message that the government doesn't want to comply with the sanctions in case they are themselves under sanctions. And this whole panic when Kvanchilashvili was and hysteria when Kvanchilashvili was sanctioned, it is because the government of Georgia realized that the knife was getting very close to their throat. So they thought that they would come with a smart mechanism to mitigate the effect of the sanctions. And this is a very provincial and very amateurish and ignorant way of handling issues as serious as sanctions. Now, when we come back to the IMF, you know that the IMF had a very clear position regarding the creation of this new position, which is deputy governor, because they anticipated that the government would come with something like they have done 2 days ago. And they didn't want this to happen. They really wanted the National Bank to be a real independent institution to keep stability in the financial markets in Georgia and in Georgia in general, because when the financial market, the financial sector is stable, then the country is stable economically. And that's why now, they will look, but the IMF directly doesn't have a big impact. The maximum they can do is we're stopping our program with Georgia, which is not the end of the world for the government of Georgia, because either way, they have pretty big reserves of foreign currency, and they can close their debts, and so it's not a big thing. But what is very worrying goes beyond the IMF. There are two things that are very worrying. The first thing is, as you know, the Georgian banks, most of them work with this Austrian bank, Raiffeisen, is clearing the international forex transactions for the Georgian banks. And currently, this bank is auditing several of the Georgian banks for their transactions to see if they were in conformity with the standards. A year ago, Deutsche Bank has decided to leave Georgia and not to play this role. And this Austrian bank took over. Now, if the Austrian bank feels that the changes in the regulations of the National Bank regarding sanctions can create any kind of problem, then they will withdraw. And if they withdraw, this means that the Georgian banks will be unable anymore to effect any international transaction in US dollar from Georgia. So you can imagine what will be the cost on the economy and how many companies will be like bankrupt because of something like this. This is the most serious effect that can happen in Georgia immediately.
Do you anticipate that this might come to that point?
It could, because you know they are taking it under their responsibility, this Austrian bank, you see. There is a big factor of trust with the financial players here. Now, when the factor of trust is lost, they cannot take responsibility themselves because they are liable towards the foreign government for it. And this can happen, and this can be of very serious concern for the economy. So this is the first thing. The second thing that will take more time are the secondary sanctions that the US government can slap on the National Bank of Georgia, on the people from the National Bank, on other players in the country because of this legislation that has been put in.
Yeah.
Before the sanction, there will definitely be a lot of diplomatic work that backtrack, otherwise this is what's going to happen. And you know what can happen? Georgia has $5 billion of foreign reserve, of US dollar reserves. They can be frozen. And the country will go bankrupt, you know, without reserves, you cannot import anything, you cannot move, you cannot pay your debts, you can't do anything. And in my opinion, the US Treasury is going to be ruthless when it comes to Georgia, because Georgia has created a precedent with this legislation that doesn't exist anywhere in the world. And if they close their eyes on this precedent, then you will have other countries just copy-pasting, okay? And this can have an effect on the efficiency of the sanction that the US government or the UK government or the EU governments are slapping on people and on countries around the world. So in my opinion, if the Georgian government will not backtrack and reverse this piece of legislation, it will be a very dark economic and financial period for Georgia.
But Natia Turnava tells us that Georgia has not been creating a will here, that this kind of rules are in many countries that are defending their own citizens, and that no one can have any criticism or any comment on the sovereign decision of the country to have its rules in compliance with the Constitution.
Look, you know, it reminds me of a story. This is totally false, as a matter of fact. It's a blunt lie. It's not true. And it reminds me of a story when Christiane Amanpour, you remember the CNN anchor, her first interview in Iran. She is Iranian origin, like 25 years ago, I remember I watched it, and she had an interview with a newspaper editor, and she told him, do you have freedom of speech? He told her, yes, we are free to write whatever we want, and they are free to arrest us whenever they want. And this is the same. This means that, yes, she can do whatever she wants, but they can slap sanctions on her whenever they want on the National Bank and freeze the assets of the National Bank and bankrupt the country. You know, the problem is that this government has a distorted image of themselves. They think that they are themselves the United States and the UK and Germany. This is how they see themselves. They don't realize that Georgia is a microscopic country that has no leverage over anyone in anything. And that's the problem. So we are in very big trouble. And as long as this legislation is in place, the pressure will remain very high on the Georgian lari, because people expect sanctions to be slapped on Georgia, and the National Bank will have to pay huge, to sell huge amounts of dollars.
We already see this.
We already had 57 million in 2 days. Tomorrow it will go even more, because people expect a reaction from the West regarding this attempt to shortcut the sanctions.
Today, after James John issued this statement to BMG. Natia Turnava met Andrew Jewell. He's the permanent representative of the IMF in Georgia. And the National Bank said Turnava confirmed to Jewell that all regulations and restrictions imposed on Russia for its invasion of Ukraine by the United States, the European Union, and the United Kingdom would be maintained. Is it contradictory then with the new rule?
Yes, of course it's contradictory, because
How?
already by allowing Parshaladze to transfer his money out of his bank accounts and his properties to a third party, they have already undermined the effect of the sanctions. And those sanctions relate to Russia. So this is not serious talk, but this is the kind of talk that the government of Georgia holds all the time. They go to the EU, they tell them we are doing the 12 points, we want to be members of the EU. You know, the whole government rhetoric is based on lies and on gaslighting, you know, like narcissists. They have the behavior of a narcissistic individual as a government. So it's all lies, all gaslighting. It's not true. I didn't tell you this. It's the opposite. You are making it up. This is that. And Natia is doing exactly the same thing that Kobachidze does, and Dinaradze does, and Garibashvili does. It's their tactics, their strategy is very well studied. Gaslighting, lying.
The members of the NBG's council, they said that this was the unilateral decision that Natia Turnava took by herself to impose and to enact this new rule. And this decision on a new rule was followed by resignation of 3 of the vice presidents. Would you say that NBG is in the institutional crisis today, and what that means to the financial market, to investors?
Look, I will tell you, you know, the whole financial sector of Georgia is based on trust and confidence. All the reports, international reports, have always spoken very highly of the independence of the National Bank, of its proficiency and efficiency and professionalism. And the banks as well, because they are well regulated by the National Bank, they have good reputation because they also follow all the criteria and the guidelines very thoroughly. So Georgia has a good reputation for its financial sector. As a matter of fact, the financial sector of Georgia, among all sectors, has the best reputation. So what Natia has done, the National Bank, she undermined the reputation, the reputability, the credibility of the National Bank, and that backfires on the commercial banks. And today there is an institutional crisis, not within the National Bank itself, because you know today they appointed 2 new board members that keep the quorum alive. But there is a very serious issue whereby there is a rebellion of the commercial bank against the regulation of the National Bank as far as sanctions. You know, the commercial banks are bound by law to follow scrupulously the regulation issued by the National Bank. And in case they don't, there are consequences to it. The banks made it very clear that we will not obey or abide by this new regulation. This means they are in discrepancy with the Georgian law. This means technically the National Bank can take measures against the commercial banks.
This is how you read the statements of the majority of Georgian commercial banks when they said that we stand by international
Absolutely, and they are right. And they are right, because you know, if they follow the orders of Natia Turnava, then they would be in discrepancy with international sanctions, and then you know their assets will be frozen, the Visa cards, MasterCards will be abolished in one day, they will be unable to do any transaction, and they will become like banks in Turkmenistan, like working internally with their local currency. So between choosing sanctions coming from the National Bank or sanctions coming from the West, they didn't hesitate a second, because the value of their banks will go down the drain in no time. Yesterday, you know, Bank of Georgia and TBC yesterday lost, when this thing happened, about 3% and 3.5% of the value of their shares in London. Then, after they made their statement, the shares started climbing, They didn't reach yet the level of 2 days ago, but they will reach it as long as there is some stability. So this was just a rumor, and look what happened. So imagine there is a sanction on one of those banks or on those two banks. They will go, I mean, the value of the share will be zero, and the whole economy will be bankrupt. They represent 80% of our economy, the two banks.
Yes, the Parliament of Georgia has elected Nana Kvanchilashvili and Teimuraz Khomeriki as members of the board of the National Bank of Georgia. They were both nominated by the president. Then president said that she wanted to take back these nominations, but unfortunately the law does not have that kind of provision. The candidates yesterday did not attend the joint session of financial, budgetary, and sectoral economy and economic policy committees. Then the vote at these committees took place, and the committee members did not support them. Yet both candidates received overwhelming support in the vote today. What does this process show about the things that we have been discussing here, about the independence of NBG, and about the influences, the external influences, possible influences on NBG?
It shows that the NBG now has become like the Georgian judiciary, like any other institution that is 100% controlled by the Georgian dream. You know, they will spend the $5 billion to sustain the Georgian lari and keep the regulation as is to save themselves from sanctions. They don't care about it. They will do it even if it will bankrupt the country. So this is bad governance. This is state capture. This is corruption. This is dictatorship. Those are the adjectives that describe our current government. And I mean, if you ask me, I'm optimistic. It's been a long time. I'm very pessimistic, but I don't think I ever reached the stage of pessimism that I reached today. Having said that, this pessimism is coupled with a big optimism, because, you know, there is a limit to which they can push. And they really not reached their limit. They exceeded their limit with this, you know. They have been digging their grave since 12 years. But yesterday, they dug as much in one day as they have been digging in 12 years. You know, they have the whole world against them now. The whole world against them, not only internally. I mean, besides Russia and China, even China, you know, I mean, China, when it comes to their interests, they will not even look at Georgia, because Georgia represents nothing for them. It's like a neighborhood in Beijing, okay? It's nothing. So, besides Russia, no one supports the Georgian government. No one at all. And at one stage, the whole world will decide that either we're going to lose Georgia forever, it will annex with Russia, this is the way we are going, or we need to do something to straighten things. And I think we are getting very close to this point where people are really fed up with this government, with their lies, with their dictatorship, with their attitude, with serving the Russian interests, with being a Russian proxy here. I mean, everyone is really fed up everywhere.
ICC is the largest foreign business association, and you also have ambassadors of different countries in Georgia on board. Do you get questions about the situation in Georgia right now, or is it clear what's going on, or what are some of the main questions that you're getting?
A few years ago, like 2-3 years ago, we used to get a lot of questions, because the attitude of the Georgian government was very pro-European, okay? And then the government, the international chancelleries here, all the embassies, they were convinced that, you know, the government was really doing their best to take Georgia to Europe. So every time there was something not clear, like the Gavrilov night and all those things, they would contact us and they would ask us. But since a year and a half, it has become very obvious to everybody that this government is a Russian government, and all their talks about wanting to be part of the EU is just rhetoric, which is based on nothing true. So that's why no one contacts us, nor contact any other business organization to get clarification, because the message is very clear. They don't need to clarify. They understood that this government is doing anything in their power to undermine and destroy the accession of Georgia to the EU. Okay, they're doing everything in their power. They understood it, and now they are like trying still to throw a carrot every now and then, but the baton is getting bigger. So this is where we stand.
You mentioned EU several times in the session to EU, and let me read you the tweet that the German ambassador in Georgia tweeted. "Know about EU. Article 130 of the EU Treaty prescribes the independence of European Central Bank and national central banks in the EU and commits EU and governments of EU member states to respect this principle." How do you read this tweet in the context that just less than a month is left for the due EU assessment on Georgia's progress on 12 priorities?
It is good that the ambassador made the statement, because, you know, I mean, even if it is useless because they don't care, the government don't care anymore of what the EU says, still it is important to talk, for the EU to talk about it, to underline the weaknesses, to underline the things that need to be changed for good order. But as a French proverb says, no one is more deaf than the person who doesn't want to listen. They just don't, the government doesn't want to listen, okay? Look, the government are in survival mode. They are on death row, and they know it. They will do anything to remain in power, because the minute they are out of power, most of them will be in jail. Who would do something like Natia Turnavo? I mean, this is like unheard of in any country of the world. Who would do it? This is a sign of their panic.
And we started with the IFI, and let me finish with the question on IFIs as well. We remember the changes that were coming to the NBG about its supervision service, and then changes to the law. And there we remember that together with the IFIs stood three other IFIs, with the IMF stood three other IFIs as well, EBRD, ADB, and World Bank. And they also had strict recommendations not to do that. This time, when it came to the questions of whether the NBG would stay independent or not, we didn't hear those voices. We don't hear them till now. All the IFIs are saying that they are reviewing the situation, that they are monitoring the situation, and will come back with the comments later. Why do you think that
I will tell you, because, you know, this is a political decision to be taken. It's not a technical decision. You know, the heads of the IFI here report to their headquarters, and their headquarters report to their shareholders that are the countries. Most of them, their shareholders are countries. And the shareholders wait for political instructions from their leadership. And that's why no one will say anything, and I believe that you will not hear them saying anything. I believe that we will see actions taken by the US government and by the European Union before you hear any IFI saying anything. This is my personal opinion. There will be action. As I told you before, Georgia cannot set a precedent with this and the United States government keep their eyes closed. It's impossible, because they're setting a precedent to try to curtail the sanctions. So, if through diplomatic means they will not backtrack, then there will be very painful measures, like really very painful measures. That will be a lesson for other countries. Don't try to outsmart us.
The Checkpoints is presented by pharmaceutical company GM Pharma.